Okay, hello, how's it going? Um, so before I begin, I just want to sort of clarify some things. One, I typically like to keep my presentations very minimal in words. But for this go around, I'm not as knowledgeable in these topics as Professor Al was in. So I do have a lot of words. So I do want to apologize for that. Those are mainly just like reminders for talking points that I would like to hit and to connect a lot of dots for myself. So that, that could be a tip to help you guys when you guys give presentations and things like that. Um, I usually include memes or like pictures and things like that, but since there are a lot of words, there's not a lot of space. So I kind of forego that for this lecture, but hopefully as we get into more modern times, I'm more familiar with those and that type of history. I could dive back on some of the words. Another big thing is I also don't include every little tidbit of information. I mean, we've talked so much during the class, so I know I've kind of stressed this point, and Professor Alves has helped me stress this point as well, is that it's more of just connecting big ideas. So there's going to be a lot of things. If you want to fill in the dots, feel free, go ahead. But I feel like that is general information that you guys should have in your notes. And I really don't need to touch on a lot of those things. Um, but I think that's it. I think I got all the major things. Yeah. All right. So we're going to start off. Um, so I kind of labeled it prehistoric to early antiquity, right? Just always want to have a good title for your presentation. So I just plus it's the time range, right? Okay, so we get to this idea of sort of what is sort of history or what is this idea of big history, right? So of course we talk about this idea of history is sort of an evidence-based account where sort of the complexity of these simpler components are combined with other factors to get this new big ideology or this profound perspective, right? And how do we get those sort of components, so to speak, right? So it's you get your primary sources, right? Your artifacts from the period you're examining. So anything can be a primary source. In our instance, a lot of the primary sources are fossils, early sort of written documents like from cuneiform, right? When we talk about the Sumerians, hieroglyphics from the Egyptians, right? But artifacts could sort of be anything, right? Professor Alves mentioned the notion of sort of later on you hit media, and so you get newspapers, you get journals, you get all these different like letters, things like that. So it really depends when you are looking at a period and what evidence you have and to what instance it could really be this sort of how can I use it and utilize it for like sort of my research and things like that. Um, I know I've talked about, my research a little bit, and a big primary source I used for a lot of it was stuff from the French Revolution, right? So that may be a primary source for me. But if you're talking about revolutions and things like that, the French Revolution could be a secondary source, can be a primary source, right? So there's so many different ways you can interpret something from a period or like works done around that time, right? And so now going to the second part, sort of the secondary sources, is really sort of what we do with the primary sources, right? It's how historians interact with them. I know Professor Alves didn't really talk about this too much, but I really want to get into sort of just explaining all this stuff you're going to see when you get into History 200 later in your careers if you're early, like a freshman or sophomore, right? So these are good just to have a good sense of understanding. Plus, it helps us also understand a lot of the progression we see later on through this presentation, right? There is a lot of secondary sources, so to speak, and the ways you see people interacting with sort of the primary sources. One example, Hammurabi interacting with the Epic of Gilgamesh or Edwana's sort of poetry, right? That could be considered a secondary source, right? He is interacting with those primary sources. So again, we can see secondary sources coming in from any really different, like from this new perspective. Last thing, this I know this is like a big topic. A lot of people don't understand, but I think it's good just to have an understanding of like a basis, especially early on in sort of historiography, right? It's interacting with other historians. Um, so it's really just one historian bouncing something off with another historian and sort of like going back and forth, right? If you're in a discussion, somebody says something and be like, I really like your point, blah, 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 right? But then somebody comes out, well, no, I don't really mean like that. right? That interaction is really what historiography is. You're interacting with the secondary sources or the primary sources that other historians have interacted with, right? So it's like a tennis match. You're going back and forth, right? And so then how do we see evidence being used as clues about the past, right? So we have these primary sources, we have these secondary sources. What can we gain from them, right? Or what can we see that can really help us understand a better understanding about, history, right? The first thing is sort of those fossilized footprints from, I'm gonna butcher this, but the Artipicus ramidus, right? The bipedal forest dweller, right? Um, what did that really highlight, right? We see the first instance of sort of an organism walking upright on 2 feet, right? So gives us that sort of like we see the process of evolution happening where we get sort of the four legs, then you get to 2 legs, right? And we see the progression of what we are today through these fossils, right? We can start coming to clues and coming to this understanding. Oh, there's people walking on 2 feet or things walking on 2 feet that can be like human like, right? And we start comparing and contrasting these things. You also have the split from sort of our ancestor cousins, right, to monkeys and great apes. I'll talk about this a little bit later. I have the specific name for it, right? But we see the like last remaining ancestor between the two, and then we start seeing that shift. We start seeing as humans start to develop sort of more cognitively, I would say is a better, but the best way to put it, right? Our brains getting more functional. We start distancing ourselves from sort of our cousins, right? But we still have a lot of the same instinctual factors. Again, I'll get into that point later on as well. But then we see, all right, we're still connected even to this day. And so we can use that history to give us that better understanding of, hey, look, we can go this far back and still have some connection with these different things, but yet we're so different in another aspect, right? So it's really just that perspective. Tracing the mitochondria again, I'll talk about this later, but we have sort of that mitochondria Eve, right? We can track through genetics. We can use our genetic code, our DNA code to take us all the way back through that time to see our evolution, to see how we progressed, right? So that's another primary source that we can look at. And also the 2 million-year-old bacteria, we can take something from modern day and still relate it back, to a primary, so to like those primary sources, to those artifacts, right? I would consider this, I don't know if Professor Alves would agree with me or not, but I would consider this sort of like a secondary source, right? Because we have one instance of something still remaining, but we're still comparing it to sort of something that's happening in sort of uh those ancient times, right? So it's like we can compare and contrast type thing, and I usually associate that with secondary sources, right? We're taking this perspective from this one object we have, then relaying it to another. That's how I would view it. I'm sure it can also just be considered a primary source as well. I'm diving too deep into it, but again, perspectives, right? It's the beauty of perspective. We can look at so many different things from so many different lenses, and we can attach so many different ideas to those lenses. So why kind of introduce that notion of the secondary sources just to get you into that understanding that perspective is such a key component when you're looking at these different sources. So again, that's just one thing I always teach about when I'm in schools and things like that is perspective, because like I don't care about the content they're learning, but whether they can interpret and things like that. So that's sort of the main idea that I want to portray here as well. Um, so now we move on to sort of like understanding human behavior through history. Again, that's like I said from the last slide, right? That last common ancestor between human and ape, the Sahelanthropus chatamus. I may have butchered that, but you see right here where my mouse is. Again, highlighting that notion that hey, we can track something so far back, and we still have these sort of commonalities with these distant relatives, but yet again we've progressed so different. Why is that, right? We start asking questions. And some of the similarities we share, right? Food sharing, a big thing that especially we get later on when we talk about sort of Egypt and Hammurabi and all these different people, right? They had these priests and priestesses, and they're giving away foods, especially at just said her name, Edin Edin Ed, Eden the the poetry lady that I just mentioned. Names will kill me, just FYI. I'm not the best with names, so I hope you guys can understand where I was going with the poetry lady. That's my nickname for her. But okay, so we see like how she, gave food out, to the poor. And then we can also see Hasheput, and how she gave her workers food and sort of from the food storage, from the surplus of the Nile, right? I'll get into that later. But again, we see this food sharing from a leader, someone in position. We see toolkits, right? We have toolkits, a lot of tools, right? I mean, for instance, this is one right here. We write stuff with it. This is how we communicate language, written language, right? That's just one tool we use. They had a lot of other, like our distant relatives being, apes and monkeys. And so then that's where we get that toolkits, right? Then we get leadership. That's another big thing. Again, what Professor Alves mentioned with like Caesar and the Planet of the Apes giving out the food, right? You see who the clear leader is. We see that as well with Hernan Cortez, right, later in the next point. But we see like a leader trying to display sort of wealth and all these different things, but as well lead the people or some things like that. I guess Hernan Cortez is not the best leader, but it's still a figure of leadership. Also highlights the diverse cultures, right? I mean, they have cultures as well, just as we do, right? So again, that to me gets me wondering: is this really something instinctual, right? If we share similarities like this, is it something embedded within us, or is it something that we learned and progressed, right? And you can have the argument, oh, we're not the same because we have so many different technologies and things like that. But then when you look at sort of our relatives, it's like, well, hey, they got the same thing, but just not to the degree in which we have, right? So we can see how we've advanced, but yet we still share these similarities. So, excuse me. But that's where we see sort of the implementations of our traditions, right? We see we implement them different. We progress different, things like that. That's really what you want to highlight. So I have this question right here. This is for the in-person study session, but since we're not in person, um, what I was trying to get at with this question was like, how can historians use this evidence to better understand human evolution? God, excuse me. It's kind of what I've already discussed a little bit, right? So we can see sort of this Mike and Hernan Cortez, right? It was the alpha monkey or alpha ape or chimpanzee, or bonobo, one of our distant relatives to Hernan Cortez, right? And it's like you see the similarities with displaying this wealth and power, right? Hernan Cortez with like clothes and this leadership, and then Mike with the banging, right? And it's this display of power. And then also you get sort of this idea of leadership and taking the responsibility as like the soul or like the head of the cream of the crop, right? And so that's really what I was trying to get at with this question was like, we can use this evidence from our shared similarities to highlight how we've grown and developed from sort of this common ancestor to something that's progressed. And we can also look at later on, we'll see how we started evolving a little bit more and more with sort of some of the artifacts we see from like Lucy and all these different sort of hominins, right? And we can see the steady progression, but yet we still have that instinctual commonalities, right? So they are evolving as well as we are, and we can see this connection between us. But we can also use to see how we've distanced ourselves. We've grown, and to what degree have we grown is really where I'm trying to get at with this question. I could have worded it better now that I'm thinking about it, but just to get that gist of how have we grown, but how do we still share those commonalities, and how can we use evidence to really highlight that? This is really your job as a historian, right? Is you're always doing the detective work, and I know we discussed this a little bit in class already, but you're always looking at the sources you have to sort of the topic in question, and you're seeing how they connect and what answers you really get from it. Um, Again, I'm going to talk about my research just because it's familiar, but it's nothing to do with sort of what we're talking about. But what I like to do, especially in my research, was have my research question and then have all this evidence that I've read and I even thought all these things, right? And it's like, all right, I have my evidence, but then how can I get to the end goal? And so I'm putting in the pieces. I'm filling it in. I'm connecting the dots, right? I went from Enlightenment thought to pirates, right? Something you don't think that's connected in any shape and form, but yet somehow you're led that way. And why I bring that up is because this is the same thing here, right? If you weren't aware that, hey, we're related to sort of apes or things like that, who would have ever thought that? But yet, if you look at the similarities, right? You look at, hey, look, we have tools, right? We share food, right? We have sort of a leader complex, right? We do all these similar things. Then you start going back through the ancestry, right? And you see, oh, we share common ancestors, right? We develop the same, right? And so you're filling in those pieces to get to that end goal. Sort of, that's the point I want to get at, right? As a historian, what you need to do is really start diving into and exploring that detective work to really fill in the gaps. Um, right. So now, how can we understand human behavior through evidence? That's what the E word says behind my picture. Um, as I've already mentioned, and I've started kind of already sort of alluding to this idea a lot, right? We have the Australopithecines, right? We have Lucy, the first complete skeleton, right? We see the first skeleton really that can walk erect, right? The Latoili footprints, right, shows two individuals walking side by side, right? We have the Homo habilis using tools. We have Homo erectus and Homo gaster, right? Ergaster leaving Africa, having fire, having tools, and also having a larger brain size, right? Now, it's really going to belabor the same point, but right, we can use all these things to fill in the gaps that we are needing as a historian, right? Or that we see as a historian, right? We see the comparison with the tools to our distant relatives, right? We begin to start leaving Africa, going spreading out to Mesopotamia and other regions, right? And we also begin to see as well, we start developing technology, right? We have the tools, we have fire, we have better axes, right? And that can also be related to the growth in brain size. Again, these are all things we can use to help understand how we've progressed through evolution, right? So, going back to sort of like how can we use evidence to better understand, right? We have all these clues right here. And so we're filling in the gaps. We're creating that timeline for us to understand our evolution better and better, right? Of course, this you can be like, hey, sort of the Sahelanthropus chathamists, right? They're not developing fire yet, but yet go down the line a little bit. Oh, look, now Homo erectus is creating fire. How does that happen? You can't have that unless you have these other progressions happening first. And so we fill in those gaps to see that timeline. Really, how we see sort of human behaviors, how we better understand human behavior, and how we also begin to see how we distance ourselves as well. I'm going to go back to that point because that's a good idea. You don't see our distant relatives, right, creating fires, right? Chimpanzees, bonobos, you don't see them creating fire, but yet we've clearly developed something so far in advance, right? Why is that? Could it be because of our brain size? You start asking those questions. That's another thing as a historian as well. That's where another part of our job is that we take a point at face value, but then we go deeper into it to find those sort of niche topics. Again, going back to my earlier point when I was talking about my research, right? How did I get from alignment thought to pirates, right? Is because I kept asking so many questions. And really, that's what you want to do with your research. You want to keep going in, you want to keep diving until you find something that is cool or unique or can help find you or help fill in those gaps for you. Yeah. Uh, so again, we're going now to sort of the modern Homo sapien, right? The sort of last relative to the Neanderthals. Um, Really, what I wanted to do with this part is it's still continuing along those lines of how we use evidence, but also now we can get a better comparison than sort of like bonobos and chimpanzees. Right now, we can actually see sort of how we developed from another species that is very like similar to our genetic code, right? Sort of course to begin with, how we even found this out, right? We have the mitochondria Eve and the Y chromosome Adam. We're looking at genetics to really track down this evolution. And then what we also begin to see as well is sort of flutes, cave arts, archery, domesticated dogs, right? We're seeing processes in human history that allow us to gauge really the difference between Neanderthals, right? We start seeing this culture, we start seeing traditions, we start seeing better tools, we start seeing domestication, right, for our benefits as a sort of a species, right? But also the same thing, the argument whether the dog domesticated us, right? Again, we start to, as a historian, you got to pose those questions. You got to pose from both perspectives. And another thing to highlight sort of how different cultures are, right? The Neanderthals hunted close range, right? And the broken bones that they had allowed us to see that, whereas we hunted from long distance with hence with the archery and things like that. So more efficient sort of hunting for us resulted in better technology, whereas the Neanderthal still had to do things primitive, right? Both are primitive, but primitive in that instance. Again, going with the housing on high ground, right? Whereas the Neanderthals lived on caves, that helped to our survival as Homo sapiens, as we were able to see everything out, go get the food before the Neanderthals even knew it was there, right? So again, how can we develop these new ideas, right? These new ways of thinking. Why didn't the Neanderthals think about that, right? Why did we think about that? Those are questions that you have to start posing to really understand, all right, this is where we begin to see this shift. And hence why they died out and we still here, right? Our brain is starting to develop these technologies that other species aren't. We're starting to distance ourselves as sort of like the superior sort of species at the time, right? Um, and then also, right, we see that women held a role in hunting and art, right? Gender roles weren't as strict. Um, I mean, we don't start really see the formation of gender roles until sort of an agrarian society, right? So in this instance, it was sort of primitive communal society, right? Everybody's got to chip in, right? Nobody could just benefit off the labor of somebody else. So we see sort of the best way I can compare to this is sort of how Marx views it, sort of primitive communism, right? Again, going back to my research, but I mean, in this instance, it's of value here, right? So sort of this idea of that it's a communal effort, right? It's not something where you can have these divisions of labor just yet. We don't have a way where society is stuck in place, and we're starting to see these different population increases and the population increase from agriculture and agrarian societies that we'll see later on once people start settling. Um, so that's good to also think about. And why I also like to bring those points up as well is we can also compare modern to ancient, right? And that's the job of a historian as well. You see, especially the compare and contrast between our society to the past societies. How have we improved even more? Just as a role of a historian is you're always comparing and contrasting. That's a good, like a key element of analysis. So when you're getting to your research papers and things like that, compare and contrast, it's so simple, but it helps you understand things and how we've grown and how things have changed, how things have influenced other things. So going back to that point earlier that I made, like comparing with bonobos and chimpanzees, and now we can compare to Neanderthals, right? We're seeing the evolution of sort of how we've separated, but then we separated again. We get that through that evidence, but then again, it's the compare and contrast to see how are we different. Really, why that's why I bring in these points. I'm not just doing it to like be like, oh, this is what I did or whatever, but it's really there just to highlight that process of the historian. And I think that's a key big theme that Professor Alves wants you guys to understand, and I think it's also important to understand with why we have this history to begin with, right? Because we don't have written records during this time, hence uh, prehistoric, right? It's before things were starting to get written down, so we don't have those primary sources in terms of text and letters and things like that. We just have artifacts. And so it's really up to our interpretation as a historian to really fill in the gaps. And that's sort of like the overarching theme of this whole section, right? Then we start seeing agriculture, right? We start seeing lifestyle and gender similar to today's society. We don't see this complete and utter male dominance yet, though we start seeing the rise of sort of a patriarchal system. Once we get to Mesopotamia and things like that. But then also you see the settlement in Göbekli Tepe, right? They settled near religious monuments. They traded and started farming when the population started running out of resources, right? Sort of a desperate act. They had to figure something out. They had to innovate in order to survive, right? So it gets to this question of whether it's instinctual or is it innovation. That's why I have it towards the end, so I'll get more in depth on there. But that's really where I think we start seeing this question arise a little bit, right? And then you know as a desperate act, right? You begin to see sort of policing enter the elites. You need somebody to settle disputes, right? So get it later. We'll see that more sort of defined with Hammurabi and these different law codes. But we're beginning to see these priests and priestesses or rulers or leaders establishing themselves as a way to settle these agrarian disputes along with keeping stability within the society, right? Because you're no longer can run away from the problems. You have to stay there, but you got to figure some things out, right? And so again, going to the last point where it's like agriculture arose in different spots independently. So to me, what I started thinking of was that idea of, was it instinctual or was it innovation, right? If all of us ended in this one spot, it's got to be somewhere, right? Just like how we share similarities with sort of bonobos and chimpanzees, we have tools, we have leadership, we all display of power, all these different things. To me, that's all instinctual, right? That's all things that are embedded within us. But yet, it came out of a desperate act. So could it be innovation? Again, I don't have the answer to this, but as a historian, you have to start posing those questions, those big overarching themes and questions, right? Where can we see from this? And so I just wanted to highlight that process with that last sort of bit right there, right? Where we begin to see that big overarching picture. So now we're getting into Mesopotamia, right? So we see sort of an increase in human population. That makes sense, right? People are starting to settle down more. We start seeing the rise of agrarian societies. It's going to be when you have a steady source of food now, you don't have to go chasing your food. You can just live wherever. And especially with, Mesopotamia being in between the, Euphrates and Tigris River, right? You have plenty supply of water to help your settlement, right? Of course, population is going to continue to rise. We also see that in the Nile River, right? Right when they had surpluses, their population skyrocketed. That's why they were a big sort of value for other empires. Again, I'll talk about that later. Also, we talked about that in class, but that concept comes true in this. We start seeing populations begin to rise. You see the increase of domestication of non-human animals, and then the decrease in general population biodiversity. So we begin to see there's not a lot of diversity in sort of diets, right? Hence why we need domestication. If you're just relying on these cereal grains that are easy to store, you're not getting all the nutrients. So you need the animals to help provide you with other nutrients. You need the meat, you need sort of like the dairy, that sort of thing about that chart you're always taught in elementary school. You need one thing of carbs, one thing of dairy, one thing of meat, one thing of vegetables, right? Fruits, all that. Essentially what they're doing in this instance as well, they're creating that chart for themselves. They're figuring it out though, right? And then also, animals begin to get subjugated to human agriculture. You get goats, you get sheep, right? They both have different sort of benefits and pros and cons, right? Again, I'm not going too much into detail in that. You should have that in your notes, but that is just you start seeing this trend, right? We start again evolving more and more, but intellectually instead of like through our genetics, right? So that's like a point I like to see as well. We begin this like once agriculture starts, you see the innovation start just like going crazy. All this with all these different techniques and technologies and shows to our capabilities as Homo sapiens and how we differ from our past sort of relatives, right? So now we get to the early civilizations. It's Sumer, the Akkadians, and Babylon. I don't know if you can see Babylon or not. I hate the zoom camera because you can't move it. It's stuck in one spot. That is like my pet peeve. But I digress. So what we see is sort of the start of being able to keep records and the development of a written language, right, in cuneiform, right? But also written languages started to develop in other civilizations as well. We see in Egypt, we see in all these different places. So it really tells us that sort of, again, going to this notion of was it innovation or was it instinctual, right? How did we all come to this spot, right? You started doing agriculture, you needed ways to keep records, do all these different things, right? Did people think, oh, best way to do it is just write something down, right? Or is it something embedded within us, right? but then we don't see our distant relatives, right? The bonobos, the chimpanzees writing stuff down. So then it's like, oh, maybe it might be an innovation. That's why I like that question, because you start seeing things that could be instinctual, but then there's also things that could be innovational, right? Or innovate could be innovate. You know what I'm trying to say, right? It could be things that are innovated. That's where I'm looking. Innovated, right? Instead of instinctual. But yeah, also writing, it helps us as historians because it's another primary source, right? We're getting things like directly from the source, and that's the key component of a primary source, right? It's something directly from where you're researching, right? Um, Really, the main points I saw from that. And then sort of agriculture allowed for a division of task and labor, right? Going back to my earlier point, with Marx, right, where we see the primitive communism, right? This is where we start seeing that shift into a more like what he claims to be as like an ancient society where you get sort of your elites and your peasants, right? Um, I like using Marx for a lot of societal issues just because I think he explains it the best. And like his class conflict is just something that can be looked at a lot. So I will be referring to Marx. Plus, that's what I'm most comfortable with as I've done the most research on. So I'll be making a lot of references to Marx. Please forgive me. Um, but again, right? So we start to see where this is where we begin to see hierarchy form. We begin to see these elites and rulers, and then also you begin to see sort of storehouses where the elites would collect excess tributes to farmers, but in times of need, like Edouana, you then see which call she's giving them out to them, right? So it's like, oh, give me your taxes, but then it's like, well, when if there's something in need, this is my responsibility as being the sort of the spokesperson for the deities, right? I have to give back. I have to keep the peace, things like that. Um, and then comparing it to our distant relatives again, right? The alphas would always pass out the foods, just like Caesar, in the movie where he's passing out the cookie to all the things to make sure, like, hey, I'm the leader. But in this instance, I wouldn't say in Edouana's instance, right? She wasn't doing that for that aspect. I think it was more of the religious aspect. But is times like Hernan Cortez, right, where you see that sort of role as a leader, where he's not directly passing out food, but yet he's trying to display that leadership role to let everybody know, right? So that could be more primitive, where Aduana is more innovational, right, instead of instinctual. Again, that's why I think that question is good. You compare it to a lot of things. Um, speak of the devil, right? Aduana, right? So again, a lot of the things, the first block is really just informational, right? But then we get to sort of her seals of two of her workers, right, that had evidence that she lived, right? So going back to this idea of using a primary source to sort of fill in the gaps. Um, and we could, as historians, pinpoint her existence because of these artifacts. So then, of course, her temple was, the moon god Nanu, but she worshipped Inanna, right? So I think that highlights that polytheistic complex we see in a lot of the earlier civilizations, and how forces of nature are bound to society, right? The basis for a lot of religions and understanding the way the world works was to give sort of these forces a god to worship, right? Um, Hence why the calendars were lunar and solar based, right? Um, she did bilingual poetry, wrote both in Sumerian and Akkadian, right? Akkadian spoke Semitic language, but it's important to note sort of how cultures conceived her as a priestess, but also supported her as an author, right? And I think why I had that point there is because you can really highlight that ability to sort of go between both languages and connecting sort of this connecting society and as a way of respect, right? You're not going to go out of your way to make sure that everybody can read your poetry if you're not respected. So I think that really highlights how they got rid of those gender norms, right? They didn't care that she was a priestess or whatever. They still wanted to listen to her words and listen to what she had to say. So we start seeing sort of a completely different gender norm that we have sort of in sort of not in our like we're better today, of course, but like earlier on where it was very patriarchal and things like that. Yeah, so then praises Nana as the sort of the most powerful being and compares Nana to forces of nature, right? Again, highlighting that gender role and how female voice was respected and sort of very nurturing, right? That idea, going on with Isis later on within the Roman cultures and the influence on sort of Jesus and Mother Teresa, I think. Yeah, I think that was, or yeah, I think so. I may have just gotten that wrong, but don't you get to what I'm trying to say, right? So you have like that nurturing aspect, that motherly aspect, right? Um, that's really what she's trying to display. Where then on the flip side, we then have sort of this male perspective, right? That's why I kind of put authority here. And not authority in the sense like leadership, though, like mostly males or leadership, though we have the different instances with Hatshepsut later on in the Egyptians and all that. But really what we see with Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is the male perspective to this deity sort of question, right? It's a more violent perspective than the female perspective, but also there's that double standard, right? He can use but can't be used. And then you get this idea of the war of sexes, right? Uh, and also defines kingship, but then you also get that message of humility that we talked about today in class. You get that message, after his friend was killed, he understood the sort of the value of life, right? And went about in the ways to sort of worship the balance between power and authority. Hence where we see with Hammurabi, right? Sort of the Epic of Gilgamesh and Edawana's sort of poetry is primary sources to Hammurabi, like I was mentioning earlier. And we see this shift in authority from abusing power to now being a leader, right? Being a ruler, right? What we typically view as a ruler, settling these disputes, right? You get the thing of the eye for an eye, right? And also how peasants can use it to exploit the wealthy people as restitution, and really just settled these agrarian debates, right? They were settled communities, and you needed that figure to settle these debates because a lot of things that are happening, like nature doesn't abide by a property line, right? So again, who's going to settle that dispute? And a lot of the things had to deal with agriculture, and a lot of the basis of the codes were dealt with agriculture, as we discussed today in class. So then we get to sort of these early civilizations. Um, we've already been discussing them, but what I meant to say was like now we're getting to Egypt. So really you get sort of the idea of the birth of Kemet, right? The black land or rich, dark soil. They thought with how the Nile flooded, it gave them this rich soil. It was a gift from the gods. And so then you see the unification of the river, right? But then, in June, right, the Nile was started flooding like clockwork. Then farmers knew what time they could plant their crops, and then when they weren't working, they could work on other things. And February started the harvest, right? So really, what this helps the creation of calendars. You're getting that sort of way to measure and understand the forces of natures. Again, giving an established role to these priests and priestesses, and as population began to grow because of the surplus, we then see these conflicts which need these laws to help settle these things, right? So we see how Hammurabi's law can come in, and how it influences, other major sort of leaders too, having to have to settle these agrarian disputes because of the way the Nile was so, what's the word I'm looking for? The way the Nile provided so much with the way it allowed for such a surplus to happen, right? And they stored, all this extras, with Hashput giving out, so much food because you have so much, right? From the way the Nile was so rich, and you have these systems where you can work. So again, right? So now we're getting to this role of a pharaoh, right? This is the leader, right? We're getting from these sort of agrarian societies growing in population, especially here in Egypt. And so the pharaoh really is the nexus between the people and the deities, right? Between law and order, settling disputes, the living embodiment of God. But the big thing that you have to think of is they also have to have that perspective of a ruler and a leader, right? So we see that where that influence of Gilgamesh come in, right? He understood that humility, right? And this is a big thing for leaders to have, is that understanding the role you have with how much power you have. You control everything, right? And you can't just go and abuse it. You have to find a way to balance the forces of nature. And then we get to the old kingdoms, right? The Great Pyramids tie the order of heaven to the order to heaven and earth, right? And then also this is where pharaohs lied when they died, right? They put all their riches and wealth in there, and then we see thieves, trying to steal and whatnot. Just display of power, but also just really, it's also a religious thing as well. Going back to um the which what are their names? Hold on, going back to the Göbekli Tepe's, right, where they like had those statues, those religious statues, right? Going back to that idea, that was just their version, just later and more advanced, right? More technologically advanced. Then we get to the Middle Kingdoms, right? Where we see there's a gap, between the two because of the desert wanderers. But then we see sort of the rise of sort of information technology, hieroglyphics, right? That written language represents ideas and can be combined with words. We also see the rise of a calendar as well. And then, the role of priests and scribes are really starting to be defined during this era as well. And I just think this is, again, just a way we can see how we are further separating from our relatives, right? Going back to the idea of, was it instinctual, was it innovative, right? We're seeing the innovation happening throughout these different societies, but it's so much innovation is happening with the technology they had, but yet this is not happening with the other things, right? So is it the innovation because of how advanced we are as a species? Again, start thinking about how you can relate it to past evidence and facts and artifacts that you have. So now we're getting to sort of the new kingdom, right? Hash, Hash, Hatshepsut, yeah, yeah, showed us how good pharaohs can be and can break the rules. Yeah, showed us a good pharaoh can break the rules. Okay, I got confused with my writing right there, but really showed us that, like, to be a ruler, you don't have to be sort of the status quo. We see that a lot. I don't know if you're sort of college football fans or anything, right? We're sort of seeing that with Deion Sanders right now, how he's doing with Colorado, right? He's doing good, but he's not going by the status quo, right? So give you a little like pop culture reference right there. It's the same concept, right? You don't have to be sort of this typical thing to just lead a good society. You can bend the stuff a little bit and still produce results. And we see that a lot with Hatshepsut and how she's able to develop Egypt at the time economically. Um, she also isn't the only female, but she really defines what it means to be a good pharaoh, right? Going back to that Epic of Gilgamesh and that message of humility, right? She really sets that role of what it means to really help your sort of your citizens out, I guess. Going back to if you look right here where I have in societal, right? Going back to that idea of what perspective to look at, right? Going through a societal lens, right? She's helping her people. She's doing these things, connect that with society. You can also connect that to political as well, right? Again, I'm giving you tools as historians. Like, one thing you got to do is like look through lenses. So I'm looking at this through a more societal lens, but you could also look through a political with how she has her different sort of policies, things like that. Policies more in the ancient sense than our modern sense, right? Um, why did she continue to rule? She ran the Egyptian system of work very well, right? She paid farmers to work on monuments during the off season, paid them in beer and wheat from the storehouses, right? You have that surplus. What are you going to do with it? Use it as sort of a wage, right? Foreigners could also apply for this, but this is where we begin to see that notion of slavery, right? They weren't treated as well as an average citizen, right? If you're not Egyptian, whoa, I got beef with you, that type of thing. You're going to do it, but I'm going to mistreat you. I'm not going to do all these things, right? That typical idea of slavery that we sort of understand during this ancient time. That's where that notion begins to rise. Um, so Thutmose the third, right, is the son of Hatshepsut's husband, right? Thutmose the second, sister, wife, whatever, complicated. That's every ancient society, I guess. But right, so his son comes, takes over after Hatshepsut dies, and really tries to ruin her image and her records. And then Hatshepsut was appeared to be male in the beginning, and then we saw she was sort of adopted to a more feminine image. So it's like, why did you appeal male in the beginning, but then later was more accepted, right? But then why is sort of her husband's brother's son trying to ruin that image, right? So that's why I kind of have this last question, like, was the patriarchy scared to have a woman achieve as much as she did, right? Sort of this, you have a society that's very patriarchal, but yet you have a woman coming in changing so much. Did it scare them? Did it make them afraid to ruin their image to other civilizations that were going around that were very patriarchal? But at the same time, we're getting these notions that gender norms really aren't what they're typical gender norms, right? So it's like women were more accepted. So why was it a big thing to try to ruin her image? Why did she have to appear male? Why did she have to do all these things? Again, going back to that notion as a historian, to you really got to start questioning things, really got to start comparing and these things to other aspects of the society, right? Looking at different things to find answers, right? But she appeared male, then was more feminine. It's a patriarchal society, but yet she was a woman, right? So it's like there's so many different questions you can start asking, and that, as your job as a historian, is really start deciphering between those questions and understanding the bigger picture of things, right? That's why I have those questions right there. And also these are also good for in the review session if you are there tomorrow, and you're watching this now or whatever, right? You can see sort of how I'm getting you guys engaged a little bit. That's why I also include it as well. Um, right. So now we're getting to the New Kingdom. This is more recent stuff, so it's kind of lighter on the information. So today we talked about these names, Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Right. So we see after Hasheput, he tries to establish the promotion of one god, right? Attend the solar disk, sort of the monotheistic pharaoh. We begin to see these notions. It didn't take off, but you begin to see the inklings of this idea of a monotheistic culture maybe could have influenced surrounding sort of civilizations, maybe Israel or Judah, right? Don't know, but that could be a factor, right? Why are you beginning to think this one way when you've thought about something for so long, you like as a culture and things like that? Again, start asking those questions. I am struggling. Hold up. Okay, so now we're getting to this notion that though they're trying to switch to a monotheistic culture, right? But that really isn't the case. It's not to get away from polytheism because it isn't primitive, right? You see how nature um, as something to interact with, right? And as humanity can interact with. And hence why we have sort of the priests and priestesses, right? You have the pharaohs being sort of the living embodiment of gods and all these different things. You're connecting humanity with nature. And also establishes, the relationship between the people and the natural world, right? Going back to the idea of deities and the pharaohs and things like that. Um, again bridge supernatural with the needs of the people, right? Going to Osiris and the underworld, and then buying your way, getting your wealth and your riches, right? You see how people are trying to justify a lot of the things that they're unfamiliar with by using that connection to sort of the natural world and things like that. And again, asking another historical question here, I want to get you guys in that process of understanding and that historical thinking, right? So we see this notion of how religion is an integral part of societies during this time, just like past societies, is believing in the divine beings a way to relate to the natural world, or is it instinctual, right? This is something that's arising throughout each society. Why is that? Could it just be it started in one and then we keep innovating, going on and on, right? That's why we have these differences. Or is it something within us? Going back to the earlier ideas with how our distant relatives use tools, we use tools, right? Is that something instinctual? So going back to that major idea, but again, you want to start thinking about these questions, these big questions, how you can connect a lot of things together, and also looking at how it is in the bigger picture of things. So that's again for the if you're there for the in-person, I'll have you guys discuss that question a little bit, get your thoughts and start provoking them, getting that thinking of a historian, things like that. And even if you're just watching it now, you can take a second, pause the video, whatever, think about how you would respond to those questions. What evidence would you use to help you respond to those questions? I gave a little bit of example, but I'm sure you guys can. There's more information I have not touched on, so I'm sure you guys can find that somewhere. So now we're getting to sort of earlier civilizations, right? Like I see the title and I just read it, but then I'm like, wait, I've already said this a couple times, right? It's getting pretty late. So now we're getting to Israel and Judah, right? So again, this is fresh. We just talked about this today, so I'm barely going to talk about this. I wanted to focus on the things we've talked about earlier on because they were more complex with this thinking on the bigger picture type of things. These are more informative, but again, I'm going to focus more on a societal perspective, just because, again, I think that's the major takeaway we can see from sort of Israel and Judah, right? So in the Jewish Bible, right, there's a debate about the status of women. We see Deborah, the settler of disputes, and appoints the general, but then she is the judge, which is a dictator, as we learned in class, the sole ruler of Israel during a time of crisis. There's many instances of women having power and being judge or supreme ruler, but yet when Yahweh's voice of reason comes, they step down, right? Excuse me. So again, highlighting how gender norms are completely different during these sort of ancient times, but yet they're still kind of similar with the patriarchy, but yet there's ways for women to sort of seep in through the gaps and find ways to power and authority. Um, Again, sort of a question to really think about, right? That historical question. What does this say about gender norms, right? How can we relate to these gender roles to how can we relate these gender roles to other patriarchal societies? How can you relate Israel and Judah to Egypt, right? How do you see the connection, right? They both have sort of women in power and leadership sort of take that role of the sole leader, right? That Hernan Cortez, right? That we and that alpha male that we've seen in chimpanzees and bonobos, right? But can it be an alpha female, right? So again, how are we getting there? What evidence do we have to support that? What can we compare and what can we contrast? Again, looking at it through that lens. And then, of course, after the Persians came and conquered Israel and subjugated Judah, we see Judah praise Cyprus in the Jewish Bible for his toleration for the Jews, right? So it speaks on Judea's willingness to borrow again due to Persian toleration. So I think that really just highlights how we begin to see these societal influences within religion. How did one aspect of toleration lead the Judeans to want to accept other cultures, right? People of the book, that's a big idea in those type of cultures, the Semitic cultures. Again, how are we getting to this idea? What evidence do we have for that? Again, Cyprus being the main source of evidence. And then after conquest, Judeans must wrestle with who they are and what they believe in, right? We begin to see these prophets really start to think of these big historical questions. If you really start to think like what it is, right? We see Isaiah starting this perspective: is Yahweh weak or is he powerful, right? We also begin to see a sort of Amos discuss sort of social concerns, right? Yahweh punished those for immoral behavior. Hence why we begin to see the Romans start to hate that sort of social criticism, especially that's a big idea that's followed in Christianity from, that's something that's shared between the religions. Um, Amos is really starting that sort of historical sort of interpretation, right? Where it's like, why are you doing the things that you're doing? You're going to be punished for them. These type of social criticism. He was a migrant worker, right? So he understood he was in sort of the fields doing the work. He understood those oppressive natures of sort of the elites and the leadership, things like that. Sort of that conflict theory, right? Going back to that idea of the division of labor, things like that. So we begin to see sort of these prophets begin to start questioning, right? Sort of taking on that early perspective as a historian. That's why I really wanted to put that one there, is because we begin to see sort of what we've been doing throughout sort of this review, right? As something that you can even see is embedded within a lot of the cultures at the time as well, right? A lot of sort of I know later, but sort of Socratic thinking, right? You're always questioning about reality. And when you have a question about reality, you ask it with another question and you keep going with those questions. Hence why my teaching philosophy is very Socratic, because when you start to question something, you can keep finding the answers by questions. It doesn't make sense, but yet it's accurate and it's there, right? And I think that's the role of a historian as well. You're really just asking questions until you get to where you want to be. Um, Hope that has been informative for you guys. I'm sorry if I've like sort of belabored on the point of like the role of a historian. As I mentioned before, I'm not too informative on this, but I know what it is to be a historian, so I'm going to stick to what I'm comfortable with. I try to get the main points I across. Again, if you're confused by anything, I encourage you to come to the study session. It's in BB 103, 6 to 7 tomorrow, Wednesday. I think it's the 6th. So please come by if you have any questions. Please email me, jthomas12@bsu.edu. If you have any questions, more than happy to help you guys fill in the dots. I know I kind of went a little fast, but there was a lot of information. I only get 40 minutes, so I gotta rush in some instances. Um, and like I said, just the main takeaway of this video is focus on that role of historian, right? And focus how we can see the collaboration of evidence and primary sources and artifacts and all these different things throughout the history, and start asking those questions. That necessarily is not going to be on the quiz, right? Asking those questions, but it can help you understand this information a lot better, right? That analysis, right? Going through that Socratic way helped me a lot in your guys' position. So I just want to give you guys tools to be successful, things like that. All right. Yeah, if you have any questions, reach out, but I hope you find this helpful.